This is JP Cortez. I'm the executive director of the Sound Money Defense League, and I'm here today at one of my favorite places on the planet, the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. I'm here with Jonathan Newman, the newest Henry Hazlitt Research Fellow
That's right.
here at the Institute. Jonathan, thank you so much for sitting down and chatting today.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
I, Jonathan, I'm glad to be having this conversation on Sound Money with you, because you are a big part of how my interest in sound money came to be, and why ultimately I'm doing what I'm doing now professionally. As a student here at Auburn, I remember coming through the Mises Institute. I think you were in the process of getting your PhD, or maybe you had just recently gotten it, and you had done I was over here all the time, being living here in Auburn, and I think you were doing was it a 1 day seminar, I believe, on money or something like that.
Yeah, I think there was this sort of short seminar with like just some short talks from different people here, and I gave a talk on inflation. I think yeah.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the key moments for me that I remember as something clicking in me about how inflation it's wrong, it's immoral, but also it's a policy choice. Um, so thank you. An honor to be sitting here with someone who inspired me so much in this field. Kind of on those same lines, inflation is, I think, a great place to start. We're seeing, or you know what? Let's even take a step back before that. Let's talk about money. You're obviously well versed in the writings of Austrian economists. Can you tell me what money is?
Yeah, so money is a widely accepted medium of exchange. That's the very common definition. And the main thing about money and where it comes from, at least from the Austrian perspective, it goes all the way back to Karl Menger, who wrote about how money emerges out of barter. So in a barter economy, people are exchanging goods for goods. It's going to be very primitive. You're not going to have a very expansive division of labor. You're not going to have a very extensive structure of production as well. And the reason why is because there are all these limitations on what exchanges are allowable, or what exchanges can happen in a barter economy. And there's also some like calculation problems. So if you have a barter economy, then it's very difficult to calculate profit and loss, your cost of production, and the revenues that you get, because it's everybody trading goods for goods. So there's not a common denominator. So the the essential problem that money solves is that it solves the double coincidence of wants problem. So if we are in a barter economy, it can be very difficult to find somebody who wants to trade with you because you might not have the good that they want, or vice versa.
Hmm.
And so if you can realize that, or if one person can realize that if I go through one particular good, if I can use one good as a medium of exchange, meaning that it takes two transactions for me to get what I actually want. So I accept something in exchange, not because I want that good for my own use, but I can then use it to go trade with somebody else to get
Hmm.
the thing that I actually want. Then that relieves that double coincidence of wants burden. So, so as soon as somebody realizes this, and that good catches on, or maybe they tried other goods that serve well as a medium of exchange, and people start to accept it widely. So a bunch of people start accepting that same good as a medium of exchange. Then at that point, once it's widely accepted, then you have the common denominator, and you can do economic calculation. So businesses can calculate profit and loss. You get money prices, and so at that point, then you can have a much greater extension of the division of labor. Production can become more technologically complex. You can engage in longer term projects. And so all of this bolsters economic growth. It makes it possible for economies to grow, standards of living to rise. But the essential point here is that money emerges in the market. So it's a product of the market. So market participants realize that there's this problem with barter, and they overcome it by realizing that they can go through a medium of exchange. And then once it becomes established and more people start to accept it, then we say that it's a money. And so this is completely counter to some other narratives about how money emerges, especially the state theory or chartalism, which says that money is a creature of the state,
Hmm.
that the government decides we're going to start using this as money, and then people just sort of acquiesce to that. They just sort of say, okay, sure, yeah, these little pieces of paper with the king's face on it, we'll start using that as a medium of exchange. So, at least in my opinion, in the opinion of Austrian economists, that's not a very compelling story of how money can emerge.
Hmm.
One very fundamental flaw with that is, um, if a king decides to just dump some pieces of paper with his face on it, and it might have some numbers on it, people don't have a mental record, this history of prices they can use to then decide what prices they're willing to pay. So like how many of these little pieces of paper should I exchange for a dozen eggs or
Hmm.
something like that? So it seems to me that the Mengerian story of where money comes from is the clearest and makes the most sense.
Hmm.
And it has pretty big implications for today, especially since modern monetary theory has become
Hmm.
popular. But maybe we can get into that in the conversation. But there's just a little taste of the Austrian ideas of where money
Hmm.
comes from and what problems it solves and what money is.
Yeah, and I think, when you frame it that way, when you date it, when you bring it back to what the barter system was and its obvious shortcomings, and sort of how private money or private monies have been successful, and the history there is vast. Um, I think one of the things that dawns on me when I hear that is it gives you the concept of money being a good. And since money is a good, that means there are different qualities of that money. There are things that make good monies, and there are things that make bad monies. Um, and when I'm speaking to legislature or legislators, or presenting at conferences or whatever, um, one of the things that I often say is that there are thousands, almost 8 or 9 thousand elected legislators across the country here in the United States, most of which have never heard the term sound money, or given any thought to why do we use money, what problem does this solve, where does it derive its value from. um, and so I think, you know seeing money as not just a fixed instrument without any consideration for its qualities as money, um, is obviously problematic. And right, so the thing here about the U.S., something I've said, is, you know we being individuals, dollar holders, we don't use dollars because it's the best money, right? No one woke up in the morning and took a perusal through all of the potential monies that could be and decided, oh, the US dollar would make the best money. That's not the process that happened. In reality, we're trapped. There are a bunch of uh, regulations and taxes on all of the other alternatives. Gold and silver, Bitcoin, all of the things that would make potentially good monies are shackled with disincentives. So it's not that we chose the US dollar, it's that we're trapped. We don't really have any other choice because everything else is unworkable as money. And so that, I think, leads you then to this idea that this is a choice. The choice to have a currency backed by fiat, which is to say by edict, by nothing, to choose a money like this, and then consequently to debase it through deficit spending, the inflation of the currency. All of this is a choice. I think it was Mises that said something to the effect of, well, inflation is a policy choice, and if it's a policy choice, that means it can change. And it should change, right? There are massive moral and ethical and constitutional issues with 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 inflation being a policy, right? You're talking about stealing from productive people, from savers, from wage earners. It's not. this often gets lost in like wonky discussions about, M2 and, uh, these different contango phenomenons, or whatever it is. But in short and on its face, it's simply theft, isn't it?
Yeah. So you're hitting on something really important there. What we've seen, especially over the 20th century in the United States, is that the fiat U.S. dollar, um, it was not something that was um, just so like all of the sudden dropped on the economy, and then uh, people started using it, sort of similar to the chartalist view. But where the U.S. dollar came from was it was the federal government that was making incursions into the market economy. It was co-opting money. So we had this gold standard, and it was working very well for the United States. But then you had
What does that mean when you say working well? What does that mean?
so if you have we're talking about the earlier we're talking about the qualities of money.
Hmm.
So one thing that um, led to the rise of precious metals, and especially gold, and to a lesser extent silver being used as money, is because it was costly to produce. So some government couldn't just willy-nilly start increasing its expenditures, um, and engage in long-term deficit spending. So there was this sort of like hard, like literally hard constraint
Hmm.
on how big the government could get. And that's because if they wanted to expand their spending and not suffer loss of gold reserves, they had to tax,
Hmm.
and taxes are unpopular. So because of that, it meant that governments had to be limited, even outside of government waste of resources and government inflation. A sound money regime means that savers are going to be rewarded. So as if you save in money, it means that there could be an appreciation of its value over time, as opposed to putting your savings in equity, putting in savings in something that could lose its value.
Hmm.
Uh, people people were rewarded for saving. And if you have saving and capital accumulation and that sort of good sustainable investment, then that's like I was saying before, that's what allows economies to grow. That's what makes it possible for the productivity of workers to increase, makes it possible for technologies to be adopted in production, and really provide for the explosion in standards of living that we saw over the 18th and 19th centuries. So sound money, there's really like two main things that I'm expressing here. Sound money uh, is it's a big constraint on government,
Hmm.
which means that there's less government waste. It means that the private part of the economy can grow and flourish. But also sound money provides those good incentives for people within the economy to save and accumulate capital and then expand productivity. So there's this constraint on the government, but also this ability for sound money to make the economy grow, even if you just exclude the government aspect of it.
Hmm. And that's, I think, the importance of like honest weights and measures, right? Which goes back to, I think, a biblical concept, and how it's so obvious to see, I think, when you're looking at a central bank. So even if you can try to look at it in the abstract, not necessarily talking about the United States, but this system where there's a central bank, and we understand that Cantillon effects make it to that, so that the people furthest away from the money, which is to say blue collar people, wage earners, regular people like you and me, the people furthest from the money will be the ones who benefit least from the new money, right? The people closely politically connected will receive the new money before inflation has had time to, or before prices have had time to rise, so they get access to cheaper money. Um, so I think, um, that we're seeing it today, and the a system that can be so easily manipulated, like the one that we live under today, where money is not necessarily a good, certainly not a store of value, but it is a political cudgel. It's used as a monetary weapon to harm your enemies and to help your friends. And so, ideally, right, you would want a money that couldn't be weaponized in this way. And I think we're seeing that sort of, and I speak to this as someone who is on the state legislation side, you know, by removing taxes and disincentives to people being able to buy gold and silver or to invest and to readopt their own gold standard. I think we're by removing all of the briar and the thicket around this industry, we're allowing for entrepreneurs and creators to develop within the industries of money. And we're seeing that in, for example, fractional gold, unlike we've ever seen, where there are physical bills with gold because the technology exists now to inlay physical gold into the bills. We're seeing things like Bitcoin, where the innovation in this space is so exciting. And, you know, similar to the advent of Bitcoin, which was in direct response to the financial crisis, we're seeing that again today. And so I personally am very excited, and I I'm bullish on the idea that, you know, while money has been done extremely poorly since 1971 when Nixon closed the gold window, since 1933 when FDR confiscated all the gold, and since 1913, the establishment of the Federal Reserve and the income tax. Um, you know, so the last 111 years in America's monetary history have been somber, right? This has been a horrible experiment that none of us consented to in, you know, QE and these financial alchemists who have the gall to say things like Janet Yellen saying, you know, we're living in a post crash world. What was it that she said? Something of, we'll never see another financial crash in our lifetime,
Yeah.
or something like that. Um, and so the gall that comes from a technocratic approach to monetary policy, where you believe that, oh, if I just run one more regression, if I just tinker this one formula a little bit, I will finally have, voila, the number that will make the economy run smoothly. And you know, that sort of thinking, and that extends past money. Obviously, you can see how the belief that the government has all of the correct information has harmed us in so many ways. You COVID, foreign wars, nutrition, all of these things that the government has led its people astray on. And I think so. You have Hayekian problems there about how knowledge is dispersed throughout society, and so we see it in money, right? You have a PhD farm of economists that all work for the Federal Reserve, that all swear if they just tinker with the math, they'll get it right. And it's such a far cry from sound money, from what I think Mises, Rothbard, Hayek, what their ideas on denationalization and competition in currency and the importance of sound money. Because, like you said, it's twofold, right? It uh, it constrains a government that would otherwise spend recklessly and become too large, and it allows for the infrastructure that we need, that ultimately is what uh, increases life longevity and general happiness within people in the society. Um, so yeah, I think we're seeing now, obviously, the massive effects of inflation, right? When you increase the money supply by 40% over 18 months, you you have to see inflation, right? And I actually, that brings me to a good question, because I've been, you know, I think it was Cantillon that said, or rather, no, when we think about inflation today, inflation is used to mean prices going up.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not necessarily the way economists define inflation or use the word inflation, is it?
Right. So there's been this sort of terminological change, and I think I could be wrong on the dates, but I think it started happening in the 70s and 80s, where the term inflation was starting to be used to refer to the increase in prices
Hmm.
as a result of the change in the money supply. But yeah, back in the day, inflation simply meant an increase in the money supply. And, you know, there's some like more precise definitions. about does it have to be an increase in money supply in excess of money demand? Um, and then Rothbard had his own definition that was based on increase in the warehouse receipts, the paper tickets on top of specie. But yeah, the main idea is that it used to refer to an increase in the money supply. But I'm really glad that you brought up the Cantillon effects, because that Cantillon effects are so important. And in the in mainstream economics, whatever the school of thought, there's this idea that money just causes this like level rise in prices, where and it might take some time, depending on the economist that you ask, where increase the money supply, then over the course of like 2 years or something, then you'll have the same sort of increase in the price level. But the importance of Cantillon effects really, um, it's so important because it explains why fiat inflation is theft. Because the reason why you mentioned the dates 1913, 1933, and 1971, the reason why the the US government started co-opting money is because they saw that there were benefits that they could accrue to themselves. It was
Mm-hmm.
it was a way of expropriating real resources from the private economy without doing something so unpopular as direct
Mm-hmm.
taxation. So it if we could, I think this is like one of the most important uh, battles of ideas that we have today. If we can get people to recognize that when they see higher prices at the gas station, higher prices at the grocery store, higher prices for anything that they buy, whether it's cars, homes, if they start to recognize that this is this is not something that's like a natural part of the workings of a market economy, but I'm paying these higher prices because the government has debased the currency.
Mm-hmm.
The government has taken over what the market has produced as money, so that they could expropriate resources, and that's why I'm paying these higher prices. So if people could start to mentally equate the higher prices that they're paying as a result of the monetary inflation with taxation, then I think we would be winning a very important battle, because then monetary inflation would become that much more
Mm-hmm.
unpopular.
And I think so. I'm glad you brought that up because we've seen, excuse me, the what what has to be one of the greatest sleight of hands that misdirections that has been perpetuated on the economy in the last 50 or 60 years. You know, here in it was Trump was in office and they started spending money the way the American government started spending money the way it was, um, which was an increase by a lot. And at first we were told there would be no inflation, right? Uh, uh, Press secretaries were going before cameras and standing before a pulpit every day and saying, "We've talked to economists, and every single economist we've talked to tells us there will be no inflation." Okay. But then there was inflation, but then it was transitory, right?
Yep.
So worry not, it'll pass. It's just transitory. And what was next? After that, it was, well, it's been too long to keep calling it transitory. So now it's Putin's fault, right? It's the Ukraine war. Putin is responsible for this. I believe it was an article in the Atlantic that posited that inflation was the fault of consumers, right? If you don't want to pay higher prices, you shouldn't be buying so many things. Be poor, peasant.
Yeah. Or
And
my favorite was the corporate greed ones.
that's where we're at now, right? So inflation is not the fault of uh, increasing the money supply to dilute the purchasing power of everyone's dollars. It is actually the fault of the CEO of Subway. So, and that in and of itself, I've been thinking recently about how think about what all of the things that sort of conclusion implies. What you're talking about is a giant conspiracy where all of these different market actors who sell all of these different goods in all of these different stores are all coming together to say, let's all raise our prices up really high. And somehow that is more palatable to many people than the government just printed too much money and now your money is diluted.
Yeah, it's a remarkable um example of gaslighting. But I mean, that's what the government has to do. So I mean, I think the people at the top, I think they realize that the only way that we're going to be able to spend as much as we want is if we have this control over the money. And so whenever we do have these unpopular outcomes like uh, unprecedented or historic price inflation, I guess we should say, it means that they've got to deflect. They've got to latch on to the other narratives that are currently popular to try to deflect. And so that's where you see the corporate greed, blaming consumers, blaming supply chain issues, blaming basically anything else besides what what should be obvious to anybody, which is that it's there's something wrong with the money.
And this is a tale as old as time. I think, Adam Ferguson's "When Money Dies." He That's a great book if you haven't read it, but he it talks about how similarly before the German mark was hyperinflating, the government was doing the same thing that we're seeing the U.S. government do, where oh, it's the fault of the labor unions, it's the fault of the truckers, it's the fault of bad weather that spoiled crops, and so it's just a constant pivot, similar to the way a petulant child might never take responsibility and just no, it was my brother's fault. No, it was my sister's. Oh, my teacher didn't like. So it reminds me of it's the posture of that of a child. And I think so we're talking about money in obviously an economic sense, but second to language, money is the greatest communicative tool that humans beings have or use, right? Almost every interaction you have with other humans or with the world around you has some financial element to it. Maybe not like a direct dollar to dollar exchange, but if you're in a park, who paid for that park? If you're going to a movie, who's paying for the movie? Anyway, money is a communicative tool that we all use. And, our ability to save it and invest in it, and know that that value will be there. When there is a money that can't be trusted, quote unquote, a money whose purchasing power is withering away, I think you're left with three bad options when in an inflationary system, right? You can spend the money that you get instantly to try to preserve the purchasing power while you have it. So, and that, obviously incentivizes consumerism and things like this. You can save the money and pay the inflation tax. The reported inflation in the US today is, I think, near 4%. But if you've walked into a grocery store or done anything that requires money in the last 18 months, you know that it's much higher than 4%. Or you can try to invest it and you can try your hand at the risky stock market casino where you're investing in ETFs and mutual funds that you don't even really understand. So, like, this sort of inflationary system creates a hamster wheel for people where you're having your money has to grow, otherwise you're losing.
Mm-hmm.
And so many, right, we're seeing food insecurity, homelessness in major cities unlike I think we've ever seen in the United States. And not enough people are going around and saying, wait, the money is broken. Why? So what do you think we need to do? What do you think the prospects are moving forward?
I mean, that's a tough question. I think one thing that needs to be on everybody's radar is the prospect of a central bank digital currency.
Mm,
I think the implementation of something like that would be, I mean, we would, you mentioned the string of dates, the 1913, 1933, and 1971. Those were like sort of the pivotal dates in the destruction of the dollar. Um, but I think if we get a CBDC, then we would include that date, whatever it is. Hopefully never.
mhm,
But and the reason why is because at that point there would be like literally no constraint on the government in many regards. So I mean, there's the invasion of privacy aspect,
mhm,
but there's also if we have a central bank digital currency, then they could do all sorts of things. They could finally impose negative interest rates.
mhm,
They could limit how much you spend. They can impose all different sorts of taxes and weird forms of expropriation. Um, so, and another thing that would do is that that would be like the final centralization of the banking system. because if they get rid of physical cash, then and everybody has basically a checking account with the Fed, even if it's administered by quote unquote private commercial bank that's just administering the CBDC. It means that there's that's one less check that we have on the banking system as well. There's nothing that we can pull out of the banking system, because if we're all using this basically one bank for all of our transactions, then there's no way that we could say, hey, I think what's going on is bad and unsound. Therefore, I'm gonna pull my
Mhm.
money out.
We're trapped.
Yeah, yeah. It's I think that would be the final nail in the coffin for sound money. So like people think that the current U.S. dollar system is bad, which it is. I think the sorts of outcomes that we would see with a central bank digital currency would be even worse. It'd be
Hmm.
it'd be terrible.
Hmm. Yeah.
So, I mean that doesn't sound very hopeful.
Well, I think, I mean, you're right, right? We don't even have to imagine to see how this would impact, right? We've got like the Canadian convoy, for example. We saw that if you support a cause that the government does not like,
Hmm.
they will shut your access down to financial life, which is in modern society, your access to money is a literal lifeline.
Hmm.
And we see, and that's the Canadian side, and we see in Africa, for example, you have examples of people protesting police, Hong Kong, people protesting police and not being able to use the money. So they're adopting things like Bitcoin and other decentralized currencies to be able to work around what is a tool of surveillance in many cases. Um,
So I think that is the element of hope that I have, um, in that I think the central bank digital currency, the prospect of that is pretty unpopular
mhm.
as it is. Of course, there's no telling what sort of propaganda the government will be able to come up with, or not even propaganda, but just sheer force to make people use it.
Or incentives,
Yeah,
shoestrings to
yeah,
have people
yeah.
adopt it.
So, but I think the element of hope is that if and when they implement that sort of thing, they might, sort of like the COVID phenomenon, where I think the government might overplay their hand, and instead of getting people to adopt it and go along with it, I think there could just be a complete rejection. In that case, you could see a collapse in the demand for the dollar, and people will go towards alternatives like Bitcoin,
Hmm.
gold. Um, so I mean that's the element of hope that I have, and that's why I think that, like, the ideas and the way that we spread the ideas is so important, because I mean, what does it take for us to actually achieve these sorts of goals? And the answer is we've got to convince enough people that
Hmm.
inflation is bad, central bank digital currency is a terrible idea. If you see higher prices at the grocery store, then you should attribute that to government expropriation of resources and not something like corporate greed. Um, so there's a an ideological game that we have to play to convince people, so that when these incursions come in the future, people will reject it more and more.
Hmm.
And around the world, to be more optimistic, we are seeing that. So like we're seeing Mises's ideas become more popular in Brazil. We were talking about this before the recording started. Javier Milei in Argentina. So there's all these little pockets of of people embracing free markets, embracing sound money, and so we've got to latch onto that, encourage
Hmm.
them, and spread the ideas of liberty as much as
Hmm.
we can.
Yeah, and I think, on my end, from what I'm seeing, I am optimistic about this on the state level because, for example, on this anti-CDC, anti-CBDC stuff,
It's a
I
mouthful.
yeah, right. um, we're passing legislation in states with anti-CBDC language, going into a state's statute code and saying and changing, editing the definition of money to say money does not include central bank digital currencies in
Mhm.
this state. Nebraska has passed legislation like this. Ron DeSantis in Florida has signed legislation like this in the law. Kristi Noem in South Dakota. Tennessee also had one. So states themselves, legislatures, I think, are as far as money goes, right? Because the the monetary problem that we're living in today is largely a result of the Federal Reserve and of federal policies, but that doesn't mean that there isn't things that states can't do.
Right, right.
So and states are waking up to the 10th Amendment that allows them to do what they need to do because these are powers um, not explicitly listed to the federal government. And so states are allowing individuals to buy and sell gold and silver, to adopt their own gold standard, to remove those disincentives. They're bolstering their own pension funds, buying, holding physical gold in their state. They're building in state depositories. And importantly, they are passing this anti CBDC stuff in concert with. So while they are actively removing the shackles that are currently on the few remaining lifeboats that exist in the form of sound money, they're also, on the other side, combating the federal overreach that will certainly come by saying any Federal Reserve digital currency or not necessarily Federal Reserve, but a government mandated digital currency, foreign or domestic. We're not doing this here in our state because you're right. You know, there are massive Fourth Amendment issues, the consolidation of the banking system, and I think, oh, for example, this FISA 702, I don't know how caught up you are on Americans' Fourth Amendment rights being violated, but it's happening en masse. And money is one of the ways this is happening. The courts is another way this is happening. Um, and no one asked for this. And so I think we're between the legislative work that the Sound Money Defense League and that other groups around the country are doing, between the Mises Institute, which, gosh, I'm hearing all over these days. I'm hearing it in UFC octagons. I'm hearing Tucker Carlson have Ron Paul tell him about the Mises Institute. Millay the other day was listing his favorite economists and listed several of names of
Mm-hmm.
people who have studied and taught here, spent time here. So yeah, I think you know, I think that the adoption of MMT, modern monetary theory, and sort of in practice, the idea that the government can deficit spend for a while without causing harm. Um, all of these things are active problems right now, and we are actively suffering the consequences of what we believe, what we know to be fallacious, incorrect, um, and despite that, or it because of that, um, there's a quote I think written up in the other room about how Mises said, "Do not give in to evil, but proceed ever boldly against it," or
Mm-hmm.
something
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that. Um, and so we're talking about something as sort of esoteric as money and sound money, and it's sort of academic, but there's a reality to this. Affects all of us.
Yeah.
Every single one of us uses money. Every single one of us uh, is employing means to reach ends, and the government is making it active. But the government is pricing people out of life by policy, through
Mm-hmm.
policy. Um, and so I appreciate all the work you do. I appreciate the work the Mises Institute does. Thank you for having this conversation with me. I'm looking forward to, like I mentioned earlier, sound money is so important, and not enough people talk about it or familiar with the concept. And so anything we can do to get the word out, to help people learn and understand. Um, at the Sound Money Defense League, we're super supportive of that. At the Mises Institute, I know y'all are, as someone who went through college as a 19-year-old and running around these halls. So I appreciate the work all y'all do. And yeah, thank you for joining me. Is there anything you want to leave with? Any final thoughts?
Well, just to comment on what you were talking about there with the state legislatures and really there's this you're right, there is this sort of like growing movement that's anti DC. All of the tinkering, all the technocratic elites that are in DC and in the Federal Reserve, there definitely is. It seems like the tide is turning, uh, and it just highlights that like freedom is popular, like
Mm,
sound money is popular. The it's a very compelling and easy to grasp set of concepts that if we just let people be free, then there's going to be all of these positive benefits. And so it's very easy to read the headlines and become very pessimistic, but if you know where to look, and if you see the fervor that people have in state legislatures and around the world for freedom and sound money, then there really is a case for optimism. There's no reason to be so pessimistic. And if you are pessimistic, I mean, let that drive you
Hmm.
to just keep working harder. Keep you know it, hopefully you're not so pessimistic that you just sort of give up on the battle of ideas. So it's worth fighting.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, thank you, Jonathan. And we'll talk again soon. Thanks, man.
Yeah, it's great to talk with you.